it's good to see you all out there today. It's another episode of Holy Highlights. I'm here with Jeff. Jeff, say hi.
Hello. I'm glad I was able to strong arm you into Holy Highlights, because weren't you threatening to call this yakking with pastors?
Monday morning's sermon yakking,
Uh-huh.
like Monday morning quarterbacking.
Oh, is that what you were going for?
Yeah.
I was just afraid that associating sermons with a synonym for throwing up might be bad for us long term.
Yeah.
Well, that connection in our people's minds.
Well, but that may be the closest connection they have after some of the sermons. I had a guy one time tell me after I preached a sermon that he had heard worse. I think he was trying to compliment me, but that was like, oh, well, I have too, I guess.
When I was a young preacher, I was still in seminary, and the school would often tell you these small little outlying churches, that just need a pulpit supply, and you wrote one good sermon and you took them on a tour to all of those churches. I think we had a contest of who could make the most money off of one sermon. But I went to one of these small little churches, and I got done preaching, and a nice old woman greeted me at the door, and she was shaking my hand, and she said, "I want you to know just how great that was." And my heart soared, because again, first year, second year seminary student, I'm not a preacher yet. And I'm like, "Thank you so much." And she's still holding my hand and shaking it. And she said, "I could hear every word of it."
Yeah.
Just because my voice was deep. She didn't say anything about the content.
That's all that matters.
Yeah. Sermon yakking it is then, maybe.
Well, that's I had a guy tell me one time, or I told my son preached a sermon, and he said, when it's time to speak, stand up, speak up, and when you're done, shut up. And that was his 3 points on preaching sermons. And so I try to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So what's up, man?
Well,
what do you got for me today?
Yeah. Enjoyed. So you are doing double the work now. You're making me feel lazy, because you put out both a worship video and a podcast. And so, and having, watched and listened to both, it was pretty clear that your worship video kind of kept referencing back to the podcast, that was kind of the sermon content. I'm hoping we'll talk about both, but I wanted to start with the podcast you did with Mara. Is that all right with you?
That's fine.
All
Whatever you want to take it,
bud. So let's see. In the podcast, you began by noting important guests, and you had one, and Mara then said the very Christian thing and said, "I'd like to think that every person that comes to my house is important," and then you blushed. You're gonna have to quit having her on there. She's just,
great.
Gonna keep elevating your game. You're gonna look smaller and smaller.
Yes, that's right.
So silly question to get us into this. What 3 people, dead or alive, would you like to have dinner with? And you can't pick Jesus because cliches.
Right. Abraham Lincoln. I'm a big Lincoln guy. That's an easy one. That's on the top of the list. I don't know. Maybe Mark Twain. I bet Mark Twain would be an interesting dinner guest.
My list. He's on my list.
He's on your list?
Yeah. Did you know that Mark Twain was Presbyterian? It's like next to
really?
Yeah, next to Mr. Rogers. It doesn't get much better than that, right?
Well, and he's the one that said it's not the things in the Bible he doesn't understand that scares him, it's the things he does understand. He understands that scares him.
Yeah, he had a really great quote too from an autobiography about how, he was mostly a pretty good Presbyterian as a young boy until the weather turned nice, and then he didn't quite keep the faith as much.
So Lincoln and Mark Twain, I'd have to think about the third guest. Maybe it'd be a sports related. Maybe I'd kind of veer off into that era. Maybe Bobby Knight. I'm an Indiana kid, so maybe it'd be good to sit and share stories with Bobby Knight, let him throw chairs at me.
I mean, Mark Twain. Yeah, as I say, Mark Twain says one witty thing about Bobby Knight, and the next thing you know, the table's being turned over. Bobby Knight's going after him. That'd
be awesome, though.
Yeah.
Talk about a fun dinner party.
Yeah, and you got Lincoln somehow trying to, negotiate 2 sides, and somehow he ends up dead in the dinner for it. So that's.
I'm just thinking about that dinner party: Mark Twain, Abraham Lincoln, and Bobby Knight. That sounds like a joke, doesn't it?
It really does. It does, without a punchline.
Yes.
Good. Let's get into something more serious so that people don't tune out. We really should start with something good at the beginning, or else they'll never make it to the third or fourth
All right.
minute. Early on in the podcast, you note that Jesus just couldn't win with the religious authorities of his day. Then near the end of the podcast, Mara raises the issue of entitlement. Now, I know that you guys didn't necessarily draw those things together, but is there a connection?
Oh no, there's
Or-
absolutely a connection between the ideal of entitlement. It's interesting. By the time you get into deeper into the book of Acts, the confrontations that Jesus had with the Pharisees begin to come along. It's the Sadducees that really push back against Jesus. It's the Sadducees that crucified Jesus. And the Sadducees were more the Greek thought. The rejection of resurrection, all those kind of things. And the Sadducees were in the places of powers more so than even the Pharisees. The Pharisees had some position with the people, but really not with the government, not to the same extent as the Sadducees. And so this is about power, and this is about influence. Now Simon's a Pharisee, but it's about influence, and Jesus is beginning to influence more people than the Pharisees are. And, I always think it's kind of an interesting thing. You look back at the New Testament and you have that very fascinating story of Jesus where he's in the temple and he's teaching, or they're amazed at his wisdom because of how he's listening, is I think how it's written in the Gospels. But I always kind of believe that Jesus kind of felt in his inner being that he was going to be a teacher, and wondered if he would not be a Pharisee as he grew up. And he ends up this carpenter, and yet he still ends up being a teacher. And so, and he's quickly outpacing the Pharisees. The people are flocking to him, and he's teaching in ways that they can't even begin to, that's beyond what the Pharisees were doing. And so, yeah, there's entitlement. He is definitely upsetting what the Pharisees thought should be.
Yeah. So he, in a way, he sort of attacks the religious authorities of his day, not in their weaknesses, but in their strengths. The Pharisees are the great teachers. He's the better teacher. The Sadducees want to saddle up next to power, and he's the king.
Right.
Do you think that the church today, religious leaders today, you and me, are tempted to fall into these same patterns with Jesus, that he couldn't win with the religious authorities of this day either? Do Christians still fall into the Pharisees and Sadducees trap?
Oh yeah, I think we can definitely, and when I talk about movement in the sermon, I mean we tend to rely on organization more than movement. We tend to want to have our hands on everything. As a pastor, we like to be able to control the ministries, and that's one of the things that causes the greatest fear, I believe, for pastors in a time like this, is we've got to let go. We can't control everything that's going on. We can put resources out there, but what people will do in this time is dependent on them and not me kind of directing it. And so, yeah, I think that we try to control the move of God. It's easier to control the move of God. That's why most pastors concentrate, most of our effort is spent on what? The Sunday morning sermon, because we can control that. That's an hour time that we can regiment, that we can control, we can rehearse, we can have exactly what we want in it. And I think sometimes we temper the move of God because we place so much emphasis on that solitary hour instead of the rest of the 167 hours a week that people are out there and could be moving with God and creating change.
Yeah. And we also can do that because we can delude ourselves that for that 1 hour, surely they have to be listening to us and not making a grocery list in their head during the sermon, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I have felt that a little bit in terms of, creating worship videos, creating these sort of holy highlight reel videos, like putting resources before the congregation and recognizing now my full limitations, that like I can give them the best I can in this quarantine circumstances. but it's really going to be up to them to grab hold of it and to use it to their own spiritual growth.
Right.
And then I realized, oh, it's kind of always that way.
It's supposed
You
to be
know?
that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is just revealing more starkly what is perpetually true.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's one. I've been trying to keep a small list, just a mental one of just like um, silver linings, if you will, just things during this COVID-19 pandemic that when it's all over, I want to look back and remember, or just moments of grace or mercy that break through. And so that's one of them is, after this, hopefully we won't be I guess arrogant is the best word I can come up with right now, but just thinking like we're ever fully in control,
Right.
and then experiencing entitlement with that.
Right.
So you focused on the parable of Jesus tells, where a man has a debt of 50 denarii and another has debt of 500 denarii, and both are forgiven, and which would be most grateful, and it's the 500 denarii guy. First off, there's another version of this parable, or at least this premise to the parable, in which two men's debts are forgiven, and the man who has the biggest debt forgiven then goes out and starts like beating on a guy who owes him like pennies.
Right.
So what do we think here? Jesus just phoning it in with this particular parable this time, just using the premise without the full.
Using the same sermon illustration they used last week.
Yeah, isn't that great? Isn't that so relieving that even Jesus is like, I'm going to dip back into this story you all know because it applies.
It's an old joke, but it's funny.
Yeah. Now, you all made a pretty good point there, that we're all forgiven to the measure we need. And
Right.
I loved that. I was like, oh, yeah, because you start off, I think Mara says it, like our brains just clamor to make sense of these things. So we start trying to find ourselves in the parable, and we're like, okay, well, am I the 50 guy or the 500 guy? And I think where you all end up is just like, it doesn't really matter the number so much. We all receive grace to the measure that we need. So why do you think we go into that comparison game?
Well, can we go back to the other parable first? The other parable, I believe, is related to our duty or our obligation, our need to forgive if we're going to receive forgiveness. And I think I think even though it's a very similar parable, I think the parable is different in that it's talking about the need to forgive, that for somehow our forgiveness is connected with our ability and our willingness to forgive other folks. I think that's a fascinating parable, a fascinating concept. Whether we can, and when we talked about your sermon, we talked about self-awareness. And I wonder if there isn't something within us that if we can't forgive others, we can't even begin to conceive the possibility that we can be forgiven, that there's something within us that we have to forgive to receive forgiveness. And so there's a little bit of a different twist to that parable. But I'm sorry, go back to what were you asking me about this?
Okay, well, let's go down your rabbit hole a little bit more, because it reminds me, I've got a good buddy, Jake, who just preached this past Sunday on judge not lest ye be judged. And he wanted to make it very clear, and I thought he did a fine job with this, though I hate that I had to just put that on a recording because I'll hold this over my head later. His ringtone is going to be, he did a fine job with this. He did a fine job with this. But he said it's not that like whatever standard you judge others by, like God then writes that down and then applies it to you. He's like, that's absurd. That means we could control God's understanding of justice. Like, that's not it. Rather, what happens is whatever we judge others by, we always turn around and internalize and judge ourselves by, right? Like, and I think there's a connection there. Like, what we're able to forgive others for, we can then find the spiritual and moral resources to forgive ourselves, and receive forgiveness, I should say, in those places, which is why we're pushed to forgive the biggest of sins in other people, so that we can sort of sow the field of our own souls with that sort of forgiveness and be prepared to actually accept that forgiveness from God.
Right.
So no,
Which is,
that's
forgiveness is a radical, extraordinary thing.
yeah,
And we're called to radically and extraordinarily forgive, so that we can receive radical and extraordinary forgiveness from God. So yeah, we go a long time talking about that.
yeah. So, well, I guess the question I have now feels a lot less important than the conversation we're just having, which is what's great about this video cast. But just that, why do we want to play the comparison game? Why do we try to seek to put ourselves into categories? I mean, I know the parable sort of invites us into it, but your ultimate conclusion that we've each received the grace necessary for who we are, that seems like such a life affirming sort of statement, right? I
Right.
mean, that nourished me. So why do we try to categorize ourselves even through these scriptural categories?
Well, I think there's it's self-justification. We tend to self-compare usually to people that we think are worse than us, because it makes us feel better about ourselves. Or if we want to feel that we deserve more, we compare ourselves to people that have more than us, and wonder why they have what they have and we don't. Whatever the reason is, when we get caught up in self-comparison and comparison with others, we kill the ability to be thankful in our life, because self-comparison always kills thankfulness. I think it may be in Mark Twain that says something to the extent that self-comparison or comparison to others kills the spirit of gratitude, or something to that nature. We talked about Mark Twain earlier. So
Right.
I mean, it kills within us that ability um, to see the good in our own life, or to see it in the right manner.
Yeah. And I'm glad that we've landed upon gratitude, because I thought that was magnificent. That entitlement is really just a failure of gratitude.
Mhm.
Thought that was a brilliant insight. And one of the reasons is because I think it's good for the church to remember in general that sin is not first and foremost the doing of evil. Sin is first and foremost the failure to do a good thing, right? And
Mhm.
so
Right.
Simon in that parable has that sort of, or in that story, has some entitlement issues going on, and those entitlement issues draw him to a place where he fails to be grateful. And his failures at gratitude are thrown into stark contrast, by the woman who is weeping and cleaning Jesus's feet with her own tears of
Right.
hair, right? So, like, and it's not until somebody else's gratitude, authentic and real, comes in, that he can see his own lack of gratitude. And unfortunately, it sort of manifests itself in an entitled, self-justifying manner, which is pretty human. Um, so yeah, I love that, because I think the church often thinks that we're in this grand cosmic conquest of like good versus evil. And I'm going to say, if the story of Easter means anything, it's that good won,
Right.
period. And so now the real contest is more like doing good versus failing to do good.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I'm going to ask you a personal question, kind of a gut check question.
Hmm.
And I am prepared to hide under the table if you were to turn this around on me. Uh, what do you think you fail to be grateful for in life?
Well, we all have it pretty good. We get caught up in a month stuck in the house, and I the one thing that I've learned from mission trips to less than great places is how blessed we are, and the things that we have, the opportunity that we have. I'm probably not thankful enough for my heritage. There, but for the grace of God, go I, when I see a lot of people in the circumstances that they're in. I'm a little bit older than you, so maybe that's. I've been woke up to a lot of the things that I was not grateful for when I was younger. That Thanksgiving is something that has grown in my life over the years. Now, I think there's a tendency as we get older to move towards bitterness. And, I hope I don't get to that point, but I can't. That sounds bad. It sounds like I'm dodging the question, but I'm not. I truly understand who I am in God, and it's all a gift from Him. Everything we have is a gift from Him. But Terry and I have been so fortunate and so blessed. It's just unbelievable how God has blessed us. Not everything's been perfect and easy, but who has everything perfect and easy, and so I feel pretty blessed most of the time.
Well, and I'm glad to hear you say that Thanksgiving is something that grows with time too. Gratitude grows with time. That it is that, like all virtues, it is about habituation, about repeating it again and again until it becomes less an intentional action and more a spiritual instinct. So let me ask you, being down the path a bit further, which is maybe the nicest way I've ever called somebody old.
Yeah.
Uh,
You didn't call me old. You said it's further down the path.
yeah.
Older is
Well,
different than you're old.
uh, if the shoe fits, though, Paul, uh,
Yes.
can you recommend a way for myself and for others listening to this to be intentional about gratitude, that it might become a spiritual instinct for us?
Well, I think you've got Thanksgiving is an action that affects our attitude. It's not an attitude that we have. And so Thanksgiving is an intentional act that we take. And now I'm preaching another sermon series that I've preached in the past, but I believe that's true, that when we are thankful, it's not something that naturally springs up within us all the time, but sometimes it's a habit that we have to ingrain in our life. And so giving, serving, I believe when you're in the Word, when you're in prayer, these are all things that lead us towards Thanksgiving. Now, you've been a pastor. I've been a pastor now for 20 years, and what I've seen and circumstances people have had to walk through, some have still expressed Thanksgiving. So a lot of it's just walking through life with an awareness towards God and awareness towards the move of God, even in the most dire of circumstances. And, I say those things, I look around me and I don't have anything terrible going on in my life. I've been around people that have been walking through some very difficult days and have still been able to be thankful and express thanksgiving and express joy towards God. So I guess part of it is experiencing people that are thankful people.
That's a great reflection on the role of community in terms of our own continued, cultivation of Christian character and spirit.
Right.
Yeah, it's also, I think it's good to be self-aware when you are in a good time and to still do the intentional acts of Thanksgiving rather than just be nonchalant about that. Because, when trials really do come, when those really hard moments come, like that's the worst moment to start trying to figure out how to be grateful. Like
Right.
those are the moments where you need to have gratitude as spiritual instinct because you were practicing it a whole bunch during the good times, right?
Right.
Um, so yeah, I guess, if anybody watching this video is in a particularly swell season and, we all kind of are living under this COVID quarantine stuff, but if on the whole things are really fine, then take an opportunity to practice some intentional gratitude right now. Nobody's promised a perfectly fine life the whole way through. And if you want to still be that joyful saint later on in the hard moments, it's because you're being thoughtful about that right here, right now in the good times.
Not only are we not promised all joy, I think Jesus particularly said, in this world you'll have trouble. And
Yeah.
so I mean, we trouble is part of life.
Yep.
And it's how you respond to that trouble that matters.
Yep. Well, from gratitude, again, we're still kind of talking about the podcast here. From gratitude, it is clear that we're supposed to then evolve into hospitable beings. Now, I love etymology, the study of the origins of words. And in preparing this video, I had to look up hospital, which seems timely. And it all starts in the Latin hospice. That's Hospes, which means, and this is really crazy to me, it means host, guest, and stranger. One word, all three concepts which seem very different from one another. And it's also linked to the word hostis, Hostis, which means stranger or enemy. And it's where we get like our English word hostile from. So looking at the word's origins, we can see that to be hospitable is to create space for even strangers and enemies. And it sort of makes me appreciate our hospitals in a different way right now, that they're a place where we make space for something like even a hostile virus. Now, granted, it's to kill that virus and save the human that's been infected, but that's part of what a hospital is. When we normally think of hospitality, what does anything about this? Basically, I like etymology, and I'm forcing you to go down a path with me on that, Paul. Sorry if you didn't want to go down that path. What did thinking about the root of hospitality bring to your mind? Anything?
Well, I think that when you see the ministry of Jesus, I would throw in there the ideal of table fellowship that Jesus practiced with people that no one else would practice with. I think a lot of our Christian ethic walk deals with this principle of hospitality, that this welcoming, this inviting, this including. When Paul in his letter talks about, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, or and male or female, that there's this combination that all of us sit equally. Just even the ideal of communion, where we come and Christ is the host and we're all one family. All these things fit into this ideal of hospitality, and I think fit within the parable. I tend to believe that's a more important Christian virtue than we give it credence, this ideal of welcoming others. As a matter of fact, I think Hebrews says, when you welcome the stranger, you may be entertaining angels unaware. So there's this ideal that God is calling us to be this, to practice radical hospitality, where our tables and our lives are open to others. And I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's a very important concept. And it was just fascinating to me that when Jesus, this woman practices hospitality with Jesus, and that is how she expresses thanksgiving. And to me, there's something, we tend to think that Thanksgiving is about singing a song or writing down things we're thankful for, but I think that maybe Thanksgiving may be expressed more towards others than we give it credit.
That's nice. That's nice. That's not quite the cultural version of pay it forward, but I mean a Christian nuanced view of, like, if we really are grateful, we're finding ways not just to sing a song in our own hearts, but also then to express that gratitude in the way we treat and care for others, even looking out for strangers to treat and care for. Like, Thanksgiving is something that gets enacted in acts of service.
Well, Bonhoeffer says that the spiritual move is not a move inward and upward towards God, but it's a move outward towards my fellow man. And so Bonhoeffer, particularly towards the end, became aware that we can get so caught up in these spiritual disciplines that move us inward, that the true call of God is not a call inward, but a call outward to others. And I think that encompasses this vision of hospitality, which makes it, it's a lot more easy. It's a lot easier to control this inward move and this selective spiritual disciplines. But when the move of the church is meant to be out, and my spiritual move is meant to be out, that puts us in the control of the uncontrollable God that sometimes puts us in unfamiliar and uncertain circumstances and uncontrollable circumstances, which is we don't like that. I don't like that. I like when I can control everything, and I think that Even when you look at the early church in Acts, they had to just let go and allow God to control the circumstances.
Yeah. I'm glad you're talking about this in terms of the church, because the worship video, and sort of changing our focus now to the worship video you created, your sermon there really did focus on the nature of the church as being a movement or a mission prior to being a building and a time. And I thought that was a good reminder for, I think every pastor and every church needs to be saying and hearing those things. Especially liked the that you noted in the Acts church, that the thing that really moved them out from being in Jerusalem and sharing all they had together there in that Acts 2 version of life together was persecution. Persecution made them flee, and they'd go to a different town, and they'd show up and they'd be strangers, and people say, where are you coming from? Why are you coming from there? And then they have to tell the story of the persecution, which is to tell the story of Jesus, and the gospel grows. And so that's how the early church moved through the Roman Empire initially. And so I love that you make those points, that even something that's as painful to experience right now as COVID-19 is teaching us that, we as a people are first a mission and a movement, not a building and a time. So how do you think we'll remember that once we are permitted back into our building, back to our normal times? Like, what is maybe, again, a positive legacy of this quarantine season for the church?
I don't know that I believe that this season will change anything. Much like 9/11, there was a move towards the church, and then that quickly died. I think this will pass and people will forget it. But what I do think needs to happen is that churches have to be reminded and renew their identity in equipping people for acts of service and not being the sole source of acts of service. I believe we're moving into an age where if a church is going to survive, it has to equip and empower its people outside its walls and release them to serve. I think Reggie McNeil uses the phrase, every member a missionary is the phrase that he uses, as opposed to every member a minister. Because when you use the phrase every member a minister, what you kind of imply is, as a minister, is you're serving the church. And so he tries to pursue the ideal that if they're missionaries, that means that where they're planted, that's where they need to be serving. We kind of do a funny thing. Anytime somebody gets, radically saved and changed, one of the highest things we say is, and then they were called into the ministry. Like that's the ultimate call for everybody in their spiritual life. And I don't think that's the case at all. One of the things I've learned in the last few months, I've been doing stuff outside the church, working outside the church. I'm as much a pastor, I'm as much a minister outside the church as I am inside the church. And so it's given me a little bit of a platform. When I tell my people that, I live that. When I'm outside, I'm still the same person and I still minister, maybe not in the same manner, but there's still opportunities to minister. And the church has to recognize that. I think I talked about the Rethink Collective song, and the movement of God will occur in living rooms and kitchens before it will occur in sanctuaries. Just in the sanctuary, relying on people flocking to our churches, that time is done. We've got to be out in our communities, out in our neighborhoods. That was the appeal of Love You See to me, was not that we would create multiple worship services where all the churches gathered together, but that somehow something would happen in our neighborhoods. And I still believe that can happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like what you said about every member a missionary instead of a minister. In fact, when I was early on and discerning a call to ministry, I actually had a pastor who was bluntly honest with me. And he said, if you can think of any other way to serve the church, and you can think of any other way to make a living other than doing this, do those things.
Right.
and that was the standard, right? Like, this is it's only if you feel like you can, if it's the only way you can truly serve the church, then you know that you're called to being a minister. And yeah, in many regards, I would have probably much preferred that I could have just become a missionary. And so I envy congregants who get to be missionaries to their homes and to their neighborhoods and to their workplaces. And
That's awesome. Yeah.
yeah. And capturing a vision of that, helping them capture a vision for that would be really great. And I do think that's a good way to continue to think about the church. And well, here's hoping and praying that that's one of those lessons we come out of this season re-remembering, because I think most people know it, but we need to re-remember things pretty often.
Yeah.
We're going to be wrapping up soon here, but there are just one thing I wanted to really emphasize. You said in this week's sermon, God is not quarantined. I'm pretty sure you said that in the previous week's sermon. I'm pretty sure you're going to say that most weeks going forward, because it's an important word to remember. But as I was reflecting on it, I just wanted to add that I think the fact that God is with us and that we are quarantined or self-isolating or whatever means that God is also quarantined. And I think I just want us to grab a hold of that paradox, that there is a God who is quarantined with us and then the God who is not quarantined. There is Christ in the crisis and Christ outside the crisis and still Lord over it. Am I being completely off base here? Any thoughts on?
No, and when I'm saying God is not quarantined, I'm saying God's not restricted. Even when God's quarantined with us, he's not restricted.
Right.
He's with us.
Yeah.
And so that would probably be a better way of phrasing it. But, quarantine's the buzzword right now. So.
Right. Well, and I mean, no, and I don't want to take anything away from the pithy good news that you provide when you tell your people God is not quarantined. I mean,
Call me pithy?
I did. And pastors don't get called pithy very often, right?
I don't know what pithy means.
Short-winded, unlike me, long-winded. But no, and when you use it in the sermons, it's both times I think it's meant to really be deeply reassuring. Like, I don't know if you're consciously trying to do that or if that's just how I'm receiving it because I need to hear it that way. But God is not quarantined. Like, my present circumstances has a Lord over top of it that isn't stuck the way I'm stuck.
Sure.
And then, but somewhere along the line, I also really wanted the other one, which is that God is quarantined with us. That he is.
No, I think that's
right in the thick of it with me.
I like that.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think I offer that not to try to steal one iota away. Like I said, I want to embrace the paradox. Both of these things are true.
Right.
The God who moves free and is still in control, but also the God who has hunkered down here and should be more important to me than my Netflix password.
Yeah.
All right, last question. Like, we're always probably going to end these things. If you had to repreach this sermon this week, what are you changing? What are you adding? What are you taking away?
Shorter.
You mean the podcast, the sermon, or both of them combined?
Sermon. Podcast is fine.
Okay.
Conversation just kind of leads to conversation. But I would have been shorter and focused more on movement. The presently active aspect was important. I didn't do any justice to the breaking of bread. I'm a big James Smith. He talks about the rituals are formative and habit forming, and the habits of the church are meant to extend into real life. We didn't have time to even begin to unpack that, so I should have just let that go. And so shorter.
Okay, that's good to hear. That's I'm speaking now as all of your congregation, right? Oh, good. It's going to be shorter.
Yeah.
So, yeah, inevitably, nobody can complain about the length of it, because anytime a pastor says, well, I asked the resident Greek scholar, every congregant's just like, oh, we're going to be in for a long one now, right?
Yeah.
Let's get into what this meant in the Greek. It's like, oh,
yes.
Um,
We're lucky to understand it in the English. Let's just stick with the English and not worry about the Greek.
True. Yeah.
Back
Well,
to
thank
Mark
you.
Twain. It's not the things I don't understand that scare me. It's the things I do understand that scare me.
Yeah.
Well, man, say a prayer for my church.
I will. I will. Be
You
my
go.
pleasure to. Let's pray. Good and holy God, we give you thanks for our fellowship with you and our fellowship with one another, for the ability to come together and parse your word and to hear it speak anew to us again and again. Lord, pray that you continue to remind us that as a people, you have made us missionaries, that you have sent us into the world, and that we can continue to be be your missionaries, even as we self-isolate and try to care for this world in this unique time. Father, bless Marysville Church of the Nazarene, its staff, its pastor, all of its members. Keep them safe and healthy and well, um, and let us look towards the day when we can unite with an in-person fellowship and go be active, vivid missionaries in your world. It's in your holy name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. God bless, bud.
Yeah, God bless you. Take care.